I'd like to return to the arthropods, the jointed footed animals with the chitinous jointed exoskeleton. That exoskeleton, you may recall, has to be shed for the animal to grow or to metamorphose. And we were talking about the Uniramians and specifically class Insecta. So we'd started talking about the first of the insect orders, the Coleoptera, and I left off talking a little bit about the western pine beetle, and I want to return to that just briefly. The western pine beetle, again, is a beetle that lays its eggs in the sap of trees that have been damaged in some way. Larvae get into that layer just beneath the bark and then girdle the tree, basically consume the phloem so that sugars can't get to the root, and that'll eventually kill the tree. Now, the western pine beetle isn't the only problem. There are some other beetles up there known as borers, longhorn borers, among others. And anyway, they do the same kind of thing. But in addition to girdling, what they will also do, however, is sometimes they introduce fungi, and so those fungi may be pathogenic to the plant as well. So it may not just be the girdling, it may be a combination of the effects of the beetle larvae and fungi as well. And then this is also part of a bigger picture in that this is an artifact of global warming. One of the problems that's happening as the Earth is warming, as this ecosystem is warming, it tends to be drier. And so a really well-hydrated plant has some defense against these beetles because they'll produce lots of sap. And so that can keep the small larvae from working their way into that inner layer. But a dehydrated plant is at risk. It can't produce as much sap. So the beetles have access into the bark, or excuse me, the layer layer just beneath the external bark, which we know as the phloem and cambium. The other aspect of this too is winters just aren't as cold as they used to be. So larvae now, whereas they used to basically freeze and be killed by the cold, they're now surviving winters, and so they can continue their damage, following winter. And so that's something that historically has not been a problem in the area, which is a problem now. So when you go up there, this is something that's really obvious, is that you'll see large stands of conifers that are dying. A lot of times people think that that's damage from fires and so on, but no, that's beetle damage and fungal damage. And it's, again, artifact of global warming. And then this, of course, means you have lots of fuel, you have lots of dead wood, and so this then contributes to wildfires in the area. So we'll be talking about the '88 fires, and there have been many other fires since then, but that is something you have to be careful of, especially late in the summer when it's drier. Wildfires are a part of the ecosystem, and so if you're hiking, you kind of have to know the area. Sometimes a fire can come in behind you. You may have to have an alternate route, and that's something certainly to be aware of anytime you're hiking in the western forests. But this is a reality, and part of what's feeding into the warming cycle is that the western forests throughout the western United States are basically burning down, because this is a problem throughout the entire western United States. Now, in the Yellowstone ecosystem, as I mentioned, it's that white bark pine tree that's really significant. The white bark pine cones are consumed by grizzly bears in the fall as they get ready to go into their winter hibernation. That's a very important food source for them. That's a food source that's likely to be gone within a decade, and so we're not sure how they're going to adapt to that, and we'll see. Okay, now another order that we would find throughout the ecosystem are the dipterans. The dipterans, what they're trying to tell us there, di means two. The suffix terra is a reference to wings, so they have two membranous wings or one pair of membranous wings. So these are basically the flies. So, horse flies, deer flies, there are some biting flies up there. Certainly the mosquito also would be in this group as well. And so another reason why you want to be taking your bug spray when you go up to the Yellowstone ecosystem. Early in the summer, you'll have a lot of mosquitoes, but depending where you are in the park and some of the drier areas of the parks, you really do have to be aware of the biting flies. Also, again, there are many, many different types of flies. There are brine flies that you'll find associated with the hot spring areas. Those are not biting flies, but they're found all over the place. So again, lots and lots and lots of species of dipterans. Another group that you don't see quite as much are the hemiptera. The hemipterans are the bugs, so-called true bugs. And again, you'll occasionally see some in the ecosystem. They're certainly not as common as beetles, but they are somewhat easy to confuse with beetles. And so I'd like to show you an example of a bug. This is not really a Yellowstone bug. It's one from our collection here. But one of the things to look for when you're looking at bugs and trying to see, trying to keep them from confusing them with the beetles is that when you look at the abdomen, as I mentioned in beetles, they have a hard pair of wings that are more or less dome-like. And in the hemipterans, the bugs, they'll be flat. So they have a flat abdomen dorsally along this side here. Also, when you look at where the head meets the thorax, because of the way the wings are held, there's typically a triangular pattern that you'll see there. So when you look at kind of the pattern, the triangle and the flat abdomen dorsally, that's one of the kind of a quick and easy way to distinguish bugs from beetles. Beetles, remember, all have that dome-like abdomen. Another major order of insects would be the Hymenoptera. So the Hymenoptera include, and what the word, let me explain the word first. The word is trying to tell us that they have membranous wings. That's certainly not unique to this group, but they have two pairs of membranous wings, and it includes wasps, it includes bees, also ants are in this group. And so a lot of times people think ants don't really belong here, but when you look at the queen and the drones, there's a flying phase for those two, and they do have wings at some stages of their lives. Many of them, of course, are capable of stinging. Most are capable of stinging in one way or another. So we don't see a lot of wasps in the ecosystem, but they're around. Certainly a lot of bees, bumblebees of various types, and ants all over the place. One of the most common ants that you'll find up there is the carpenter ant. So a lot of times students and visitors will confuse the carpenter ant with termites, but they will, be found basically taking care of dead wood throughout the park. And that's another thing you have to be careful of from both carpenter ants and termites is, sometimes trees will be dead or dying, because of the action of beetles and so on, and carpenter ants and termites will get in the base of the trees. The tree will actually look pretty solid, but potentially it's riddled with holes. And so then when the wind starts blowing, trees will just snap at the base and blow over. And again, it's something just to be aware of if you are camping, especially backpacking. You always want to take a look at the area you're camping in, see if there are any trees that might be problematic, and look at prevailing wind and try to put your tent in the right place. It's rare to have an event, but I've literally been on the trail and seen a tree snap and kaboom across the trail, and you think you're going to have plenty of time to get out of the way, but I mean, it happens just like that. It's amazing how quickly it happens, and it's one of those things where you just don't want to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Continuing on, the Isoptera are the termites. So again, we find termites throughout the park. A lot of times this is one of the ways you see evidence of bears in the park. Bears like termites, they'll eat termites. You'll see them tearing into dead logs and see evidence of them. Sometimes you'll see the scat piles or the feces associated with the logs as well. So sometimes we don't see the bears directly, but we'll see evidence of bear activity, and then that makes us more alert. Here's an example of a soldier termite. And termites and ants both have some complex social orders. We won't have time to discuss that in this class, but they're very interesting. Another order that we see lots of in the park are the Lepidoptera. The Lepidoptera include butterflies and moths. And butterflies and moths, the adults are going to feed primarily on nectar. This is a blue copper butterfly. And I believe this is a Parnassian butterfly. And one of the things to look for in our butterflies, comparing butterflies and moths, is that if you look at the antennas, butterflies have what we call a lobed or a clubbed antenna. So there'll be an enlarged region at the end of the antenna. And moths have what we call a pinnate antenna. So it looks like a feather or feather-like antennae. And of course, they segregate themselves or stratify in terms of when they're active. Moths tend to be active primarily at night. Butterflies are generally active in the day. Now, one of the important members of the Lepidoptera in the ecosystem is the army cutworm moth. They're also known as miller moths. And what's amazing is, again, you have this little animal, this little moth, and this is a very important food source for the grizzly bear. So the cutworm moths have kind of an interesting life cycle in that you normally find them in the lowland areas, outside the park or kind of outside the ecosystem. And in summer, they will make their way, especially later in the summer, they'll make their way to higher altitudes. They prefer slightly cooler environments. And they make their way to the talus fields at the very high elevation. So you'll see these huge fields of just scattered rock. And they spend the days then hiding inside of these talus fields in the shadows and the cooler regions of these talus fields. And so later in the summer, what grizzly bears end up doing is kind of working their way up from the valleys. So early in the summer, they'll be down in the valleys. They'll be, basically very predatory at that time, feeding on large game, perhaps winter kill that's left over. Then they'll transition into berries, sometimes flowers, vegetation. They'll feed on rodents also in the valleys. And then later in the summer, as it starts to get hotter, the large animals start to move up into higher elevations. Grizzlies will follow them. But the grizzlies also will make their way to these talus fields. And they'll just pick their way through the talus fields looking for these moths, and they'll eat the moths. And so they have an incredible sense of smell, so they're able to find the moths with their smell primarily. But they'll just spend hour after hour picking through rocks, eating moths. So this is, again, a major food source for the grizzly bear. Fortunately, this does not seem to be a food source that is threatened at this point. And again, what the moths do is come up in these higher elevations. They'll feed in the late summer. Then in the fall, they move back down to the lower elevations, lay their eggs. The larvae will feed and then actually overwinter at the lower elevations, finish their development the following spring, and then work their way back up to the higher elevations again. So again, this is a really important source of food for grizzly bears in the late summer, trying to prepare for hibernation. And here's a look at the cutworm moth. All right, another insect that we'll see a lot of in the Yellowstone ecosystem is the order Odonata. And so this includes dragonflies and damselflies. And both of these are just spectacular aerial predators. So they feed on flies and other flying insects. And again, a number of varieties in the park. We see them pretty frequently. Another important order would be the Orthoptera. Orthoptera include katydids and grasshoppers, sometimes called locusts, depending on the type of grasshopper we're talking about. And again, they'll also be significant in the park. As I mentioned previously, in the dry years, you will just have enormous populations explosions of grasshoppers. And again, they can be really significant in terms of management of the ecosystem. And in wetter years, you don't see many at all. Siphonaptera are the fleas. So virtually all the mammals are going to have fleas in the ecosystem. It's not really a problem for us as visitors, but again, virtually all the mammals will have fleas at one time or another. And then there are a few orders which are very important to the aquatic ecosystems. And so these are going to be groups that exhibit an incomplete metamorphosis, and one of those are the Trichoptera, the caddisflies. And so the adult caddisflies, as they begin to fly, they'll fly around rivers and streams and sometimes lakes, and they become food for fish in the lakes, particularly trout. People are interested in trouts because they like to fish for trout, obviously. But they're really important to the ecosystem, not just for the adult flies, but also the nymphal stages. The nymphal stages are found, again, in rivers and streams. And the caddisfly nymph is kind of interesting because they will actually embed gravel and so on in a sticky secretion that they produce to try to hide themselves. But they're basically small predators that you find among the rocks in these aquatic ecosystems. And both the nymphal stages as well as the adults then are important food sources for trout. And as we look at this ecosystem, we'll be talking about fish later. The native trout there is the cutthroat trout. So we're very concerned about cutthroat trout populations, and it's important to keep the food sources available, and caddisfly nymphs would be one of those. So generally what fishermen try to do with these kinds of flies, we're talking about a couple of other groups here in a second, is that wet fly is basically mimicking the nymphal stage of some of these flies, like the caddisfly, and then after they emerge in their last molt into the adult fly, then the dry fly you'll try to use one that mimics the caddisfly that's emerging at that time. But again, it's really important part of the aquatic biomass and important part of the food chain there. Now, two other orders that are similar to that, one would be the Plecoptera, which are the stoneflies, and also have an incomplete metamorphosis. And again, here the nymphal stage is really important to the aquatic ecosystems. And so here's where someone's actually using a nymph as has put a hook through it. That's not the nicest thing to do to it, I suppose, but that's what they're trying to do, is catch fish with that, obviously. So again, very important part of the food chain. And then still another order which fits into this general theme are mayflies. And mayflies, again, have adult form, but the nymphal stage will be found in the streams and rivers. And so at different times, different parts of the summer, different flies will be maturing and emerging as adults, and will be exhibiting their nymphal stages prior to that. So again, I can't emphasize the importance of these organisms to the aquatic ecosystems, particularly as they relate to the cutthroat trout. Cutthroat trout food supplies, are really important, and so these are important parts of their food supply. And here's the adult. And nymphal stages. All right, so within the Eunorhamia, then there's two other classes. One of these classes would be the Chilopoda, which are the centipedes. And centipedes are predators. They're small predators that you find typically in the soil, under logs, rocks, and so on. And they have first pair of appendages that are modified with poison glands, and again tend to be very aggressive predators. And then millipedes, the Diplopoda, would be another group here, or class. And millipedes tend to be herbivorous animals. And in terms of distinctions between millipedes and centipedes, certainly their behavior is very different, their role in the ecosystem, but just as kind of quick and dirty distinctions. In the cross-section of a millipede, millipedes are more or less circular in cross-section, whereas centipedes are more or less flattened in cross-section. And each body segment of a millipede will have two appendages, whereas each body segment of a centipede will have a single pair of appendages. So millipedes look like they have a lot more legs because they have two pairs of appendages per segment instead of one. All right, now another phylum would be the phylum Mollusca. Phylum Mollusca, the so-called soft-bodied animals. One of the key characteristics is that they exhibit a larval stage, a swimming larval stage known as a trochophore larva. And so the trochophore larvae have a very distinctive band of cilia around kind of the midsection of the larval stage. And members of the group possess a radula. Radula is a chitinous plate, a rasp-like plate that they will use for feeding, and most mollusks, at least the ones we're going to be considering, are herbivorous, so they'll use that radula to scrape vegetation free, and then they can swallow that down. They have a layer of tissue known as the mantle. The mantle in most species is going to produce a shell of some type, and we're going to be looking at snails in this ecosystem. Most have a muscular foot of some type, and again, we're going to be talking primarily about snails, but muscular foot for movement. And then what we call a visceral mass. So they do have well-developed organs. These are, truly coelomic animals. And we're not going to really discuss the different organs, but typically heart, either lungs or some kind of a gill if it's aquatic, well-developed digestive system, usually digestive organs associated with the digestive system. So a fairly sophisticated animal in terms of organ systems. Now, as we look at classes of mollusca, again, we're not considering all classes of mollusca, but those that are significant in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and one class is the gastropoda. And the word is telling us that they are the stomach-footed animals, and so this would be snails and slugs. Now, in the Yellowstone ecosystem, we have both terrestrial and aquatic snails. And there's one that is particularly significant, and this is an introduced animal. It's not native to the ecosystem, and again, it's leading to a trophic cascade that's fairly significant. And it is the New Zealand mud snail. So this is an aquatic snail. And they tend to form very dense colonies on aquatic vegetation and on rocks. And so basically they're taking up space that vegetation could potentially occupy. And then they crowd out native aquatic insects, the nymphs that we talked about, the stonefly nymphs, caddisfly nymphs, and mayfly nymphs. And also, because of that, those nymphs are not available as food for the cutthroat trout. So the cutthroat trout cannot feed on these New Zealand mud snails. And so the New Zealand mud snail is basically crowding out the natural food supply here. So again, this is a new problem. We're not sure how significant it's going to be, but it is something that is a concern because there are problems with the cutthroat trout population, and the New Zealand mud snail is part of that problem. And there's no real solution to that right now. No one's really sure what to do about this explosive population. And then another example of a mollusk that we find in the ecosystem would be the class Pelecypoda, also known as the bivalvia, and these are the clams. And so there are aquatic clams that we find in the ecosystem. And in particular, what's interesting about the aquatic clams, or some aquatic clams, including some found in Yellowstone, is that they have a larval stage that's known as a Glochidia larva. And so as you look at this Glochidium larva here, you can see that it does have tooth-like structures on it. And so they will spend a portion of their life cycle actually as a parasite. So the adult clam is not parasitic, it's just filter feeding the water for food. But this Glochidia stage will actually attach to the gills of fish. And again, there's interest in the trout population here. So they'll attach to the gills of the trout and basically act as a parasite there till they reach a larger stage, and then they drop off and continue their development. The next phylum is the phylum Annelida. Common name here would be the segmented worms. And they also exhibit that trochophore larva, so we consider them to be a close relative of the mollusca. And they exhibit segmentation. And segmentation we've seen in some other groups. Certainly the arthropods exhibit segmentation, and so this would be external and internal segmentation. And segmentation is a developmental stage. We haven't really talked about it, but segmentation occurs in embryonic development. It's a way for the developing embryo to decide which is going to be the head end, which is going to be the tail end, and where to put certain appendages and where to put certain organs. So some animals exhibit segmentation only in embryonic development, some exhibit it in adulthood, and these show it through adulthood. Also, most members of the Annelida have setae or chaetae, and so this is showing us again the segmentation of the worm and actually internal separations as well as external segments. And then most members of the group exhibit small hair-like structures known as setae or chaetae. Now, in terms of classes of annelids that we're going to find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, one of the classes that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem are the Oligochaeta. And what the word is trying to tell us is that they have relatively few bristles. And examples would be both earthworms and the tubifex worm, the so-called mudworm. And you may recall the tubifex worm is significant in the life cycle of whirling disease. And so earthworms are found in virtually all terrestrial ecosystems, very important in aerating the soil, creating airspace into which water can percolate and hold water that benefits plants. And then, as I mentioned, the tubifex plays a role in that life cycle of whirling disease that we talked about with the cnidarians, that kind of odd life cycle that also affects cutthroat trout populations. And then another member of the annelids that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and you might be surprised to hear this because it's a lot of the bodies of water are so beautiful you wouldn't suspect this, but there are leeches actually in the ecosystem. There's not a lot. You usually find them in kind of the shallower lakes, kind of the warmer lakes in the summer, but leeches are also members of the Annelida. And leeches, as I'm sure you're aware, are ectoparasites. They have a posterior sucker that they use for holding on, and then they actually will bite with the other end, and they have a lancet-like structure that they use for piercing the skin and then sucking the blood. And this is actually a leech that we found in the Yellowstone ecosystem last summer. So again, the mouth is here. They have a posterior sucker here, and they actually kind of curl the body around and use that to kind of create almost a suction cup as well. And again, not real common, but occasionally students will be wading in a lake or something like that, and when they come out, they'll end up with a leech on their ankle or something like that. So I try to use that as a teaching moment and let everyone see the leeches. So again, certainly ectoparasites. I guess as far as ectoparasites go, they're relatively clean. They don't really carry a lot of diseases, which I think is a good thing. And also they're very interesting in a biological sense, a medical sense actually. As you may know, historically leeches were used for bleeding. If you were alive in the 1700s and you had a fever or you had virtually any problem, they would bleed you. So they'd either tap into a vein and bleed you, or they would put leeches on you and let them bleed you. And so anyway, they have found their way back into medicine again. They're used a lot of times when people have lost a limb, if a hand gets cut off or something like that and they're trying to reattach it, they'll use leeches around the sutures. And what's interesting is the leeches not only will reduce swelling by feeding on the body fluids, but their saliva actually has growth factors in it. And so it helps nerves reconnect, it helps the skin heal more rapidly and so on. So there's a lot of research in looking at the saliva of leeches and trying to figure out what it is about the leech that does that and helps us. So I guess as far as a parasite is concerned, they're kind of a nice parasite. They do suck our blood, but when they drop off, they'll help us heal more rapidly. Now, from here we're going to begin to move into another major infrakingdom, which are the deuterostomates. And the deuterostomates, what the name is trying to tell us is that the mouth forms from the other opening in embryonic development. So here what they're saying is that the anus forms from the blastopore. So if we go back to that gastrulous stage, that first opening is the blastopore, and that will eventually be the anus of the digestive system. So again, these are also going to be animals that have two openings to their digestive system, a mouth and an anus. And again, so this initial opening now will be the anus rather than the mouth. That's the key characteristic of the deuterostomates. And again, are triploblastic, truly eucoelomic animals, much more sophisticated animals now. And the primary phylum we will be discussing here, there are some other phyla, but not that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem, would be the phylum Chordata. So members of the Chordata have a dorsal hollow spinal cord or nerve cord. They will have supporting tissue for that, and that supporting tissue will either be a rod of supporting tissue known as a notochord, or it will be cartilage or bone that encapsulates that nerve cord and potentially brain. And then the third embryonic feature that we see as members of this group is that they will have pharyngeal clefts. And so in embryonic development, there are some openings that occur, what eventually will be in the neck and head region. In some animals like fish, those eventually develop into gills. In you and I, that actually develops into our jaw and a structure called the hyoid, among others. So next time then, we're going to pick up here. We're going to be talking about chordates as we continue in our next module. See you next time.